myself again. But it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you. If I don't say the words, then maybe it's not true. And it feels alright when they come and say to you.
Hi, welcome along to NUFC Matters with me, Steve Wraith. This is a pre-recorded show with Ben Jacobs. How are you, Ben?
Very well indeed. How are you?
Yeah, all good, mate. Great to see you as always, and plenty to talk about in the next hour about Newcastle United, of course. And I want to start, Ben, with the latest meetings that have been held and the latest headlines that have been written about Newcastle United's takeover. It's done and dusted. It's past now. It's gone. But we seem to be getting mentioned in dispatches now. And Richard Masters this week has had to deal with a few questions, at the hearing that he was at about whether Newcastle United's takeover would be looked at, whether the process would be looked at. Could there be an issue? And it's upset a few fans in the fan base. You'll have had a few questions yourself, no doubt, over Twitter this week. What have you made of all of this? My take on it has been that you're always going to get this. Newcastle's takeover is always going to be questioned. But I almost feel as if it's a dead cat scenario, this, with a bit of look over there while something else is going on in the background. I'm not sure what your take is on it, Ben.
Well, I think the most important thing from Newcastle's perspective is, as you say, the takeover is done, but there's a subplot to all of this which relates to golf. And the PGA Tour have a lawsuit against Live Golf, of which Yasser Al-Rumayyan, Newcastle's chair, is involved. And in responding to that, PIF's lawyers intimated very clearly that they, as an entity, and Yasser Al-Rumayyan as an individual, are under exceptional legal circumstances because they claim PIF is sovereign and part of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which we knew ultimately, and that Yasser Al-Rumayyan is under immunity as a consequence because he's a sitting minister. So if the Premier League were told opposite about either PIF or Yasser Al-Rumayyan, then there is a contradictory element to the information out there in the case versus the information that was sent to the Premier League. And you can understand why the Premier League might seek further clarifications. But by the same token, does the wording, because it's obvious what PIF's role is just by going to their website and seeing that those that are on their board are government ministers. Everybody knows that the money comes from the Saudi Central Bank, which is the government's bank. So just because that's been spelt out there, does that change anything in reality? Because first of all, the Premier League may have been told this and still shown legal separation. And second of all, is there any fear from the Premier League because of what they've seen in that case that it means the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is somehow now exercising control over Newcastle? And I think that definition of what PIF is or the role of Al-Rumayyan doesn't really change a great deal unless the Premier League feel like it sets off alarm bells because they were told something opposite about Al-Rumayyan. And what's interesting is that concurrent to this, today the Premier League clubs have all voted unanimously to approve changes to the owners and directors test. And one of the new aspects is an annual due diligence checking those that have already been tested and passed. So again, where this becomes complicated is if hypothetically the Premier League were told that Al-Rumayyan is not a sitting minister and now the PIF lawyers say he is a sitting minister, then is that a form of deception or does it change the manner in which he is considered? But the backdrop to all of this is still the same as I reported at the time, which is the Premier League did not have issue with the legally binding assurances. They had an issue with piracy and they delayed and continued to do due diligence to ensure that all relevant questions were asked because of the fact that there was geopolitics and there was piracy. And it's no coincidence that as soon as the piracy situation was resolved, so was the Newcastle United takeover, and very quickly. So obviously, until the Premier League and or Newcastle United come out and transparently explain the roadmap and exactly what happened and why it was suddenly approved after a long delay, we'll never know all of the ins and outs. But in essence, the Premier League's problem was with the Saudi Arabian government, not, in my opinion, the consortium that Newcastle put forwards through PIF, Amanda Staveley, and the Rubin brothers. But as soon as you feel like there is control from the Saudi Arabian government, which was the Saudis' big issue with the Premier League, because Saudi Arabia, through PIF, said they provided assurances that showed clear separation. The Premier League said from the beginning the exact opposite, that ultimately they thought there was shadow influence from the government. But why does that matter? Well, it either matters because you want to connect it all back to MBS and you say that he would fail the owners and directors test, or it matters because you believe the Saudi Arabian government are behind the piracy network that stole your rights, and the Saudi Arabian government are connected to PIF, who to buy Newcastle, and because of that you don't want to approve a takeover of Newcastle because you are uncomfortable and unwilling to do so, as long as those you say are connected to Newcastle are also the ones that you think have stolen your television rights. So that for me was the most important crux and aspect of all of it. And as a result, now that has been resolved, whether or not the Premier League really want to dig it all up again remains to be seen. So I think that there's a due diligence aspect here, and it comes back again to transparency on the side of the Premier League, because they will not say anything in public until they get to a point of either concluding an investigation or laying down some kind of punishment. So Masters doesn't have to confirm or deny. He can be very vague. And therefore, somewhere down the line, we'll find out whether this is an issue or a non-issue, whether there is an investigation or there is not an investigation. It's clearly in the Premier League's interest to look into the comments in the legal case if they are contradictory to the explanation as to who PIF are and who Al Rumayyan is that was provided in the owners and directors test when individuals and the group at large were being scrutinised. But obviously, if from the word go, which is also very possible, PIF said, listen, we're a sovereign wealth fund. Everybody knows that. We've got royally appointed members. Everybody knows that. We're under the control of the Saudi Arabian government. Everybody knows that. We have a strategy that is much broader than just Newcastle United. Everybody knows that. And we have Yasser that we're putting forwards that is a sitting minister and has been effectively appointed or endorsed by MBS. If the Premier League got all that information, but then thereafter it was explained that because of the structure, because of the Newcastle specific dynamic, and because of the day-to-day, there was no way of those put forwards being controlled or influenced. As long as the Premier League believe that, then everybody's on the same page, and the golf legal case doesn't contradict that. But you're always going to have a bit of media, you're always going to have a bit of scrutiny, and you're always going to have these headlines, because when I spell out what I've just said, it sounds wild. So we're still back at the same point here, which is if you're a Newcastle United fan, it's in the past. You love your club, they're doing well, the ownership group are off to a great start, and ultimately we haven't really yet seen PIF be that transparent or that involved in the day-to-day sense, not with the fan base, not with the media, not with the footballers. So Newcastle fans can move on being very happy with their club and not worry about this. But if you're a journalist, to a large extent, you have to come back to exactly what I've just said. And okay, legal separation, people can either buy that or not buy that, but it's irrelevant because Newcastle got their takeover. And I don't see that somehow being dramatically reversed. But when you actually list it out in practice, we're back to the same debate as before, whereby it is a sovereign wealth fund. It does have royally appointed members. It does have sitting ministers. Its chair is Mohammed bin Salman. There's still lots of practical reasons why, if the Saudi Arabian government wanted to suddenly control Newcastle United, it probably could. But legally, are there enough layers of separation to satisfy the Premier League? Yes. So there'll always be a debate. There'll always be scrutiny. If there's a contradiction between what was said by the PIF lawyers in the golf case versus what they said to the Premier League, in theory, there should be an investigation. But is any of this going to undo the Newcastle takeover, the mood of the fan base, the success of the club? Is any of it going to influence Eddie Howe? Is any of it going to have any removals? Is any of it going to somehow cause Newcastle United ownership problems? The answer to all of those questions is very probably no. And if that's right or wrong, it's up for debate. And as a journalist, we have to present both sides. But is it actually, which is the only thing the fans care about, going to impact anything? And again, rightly or wrongly, and there's two sides to every argument, but is it actually going to change anything? And I suspect the answer to that is no.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the owners and directors test is something that was, heavily talked about during the Newcastle United takeover. And news, as we pre-record this today on Thursday, is that the English top flight clubs have unanimously approved a number of changes to the owners and directors test. And the Premier League have announced that following a shareholders meeting. Obviously, that would have changed the goalpost and maybe cast doubt over Newcastle's takeover had these rules being in place. It's quite a lengthy statement that the Premier League have released, but they've agreed on a number of amendments and reforms to the owners and directors test, which kick in with immediate effect. One of the changes is new. It's disqualifying event for human rights abuses based on global human rights sanctions regulations in 2020. And of course, had that been in place, originally doubt would have been cast over the takeover. And during the 18-month takeover process, as we know, Amnesty International often accused Saudi Arabia of trying to sport wash the human rights record. So, that's one of the main things that they've changed, isn't it, Ben? And I guess, for future takeovers, that could make a difference. Yeah,
I mean, people will superficially say, if this owners and directors test existed when Newcastle were looking for approval, they would have failed and they would not have their Saudi-led takeover. And people will also say, which I think is a fairer point, that these robust changes have been born out of the Newcastle takeover, which is absolutely true. And it's quite surprising that it's taken the Premier League this long to make the amendments. And these amendments, by the way, come into play immediately. So there could be an impact on the Manchester United takeover, although a bit like Newcastle, Sheikh Jassim says he's a private individual. So there's no feeling that the government will be brought into it. But I think that the thing to understand in all of this is that if this test existed when Newcastle were looking for approval, PIF would have still argued exactly the same thing, which is that they have legal separation from the Saudi Arabian government. So the whole backdrop around the Newcastle takeover was, once again, you can't test the government or any members within it for shadow influence or control because there's not that direct connection. And even though a lot of us argued it was there, including the Premier League in practical terms, that was the whole point of the legally binding assurances. And this is again why the Premier League should have a responsibility to explain what exactly are these legally binding assurances. But in essence, whether it was the old test or the new test, if any connection was made between PIF and the government and PIF and MBS in the context specifically of influencing Newcastle, because there obviously is a connection between PIF and Mohammed bin Salman, but not in a legal sense in the context of influencing the Newcastle United project as far as the Premier League are concerned. So the point is that if the test was rerun now, even with this human rights aspect in it, PIF would be making the same argument that you can't test Mohammed bin Salman, you can only test Yasser Al-Rumayyan and anybody else that we put forwards. And then you have to argue, would Al-Rumayyan, as only an aide of Mohammed bin Salman or an advisor, fail the owners and directors test? Probably not. So this is the sort of challenge with the owners and directors test. It's all very well saying human rights, but that's just a wording. But how do you determine who you can and can't test? So if Sheikh Jassim is successful with Manchester United, then who gets to decide where you draw the line in terms of somebody that may have control over your football club? And I don't think that there will be a particularly low bar, because it sets that kind of precedent where if Sheikh Jassim ended up failing because they decided that the Emir of Qatar was going to be somebody that was needing of testing, and then in theory they said, okay, Qatar's human rights abuses, rule them out. The government are too close to this despite what the group say, so we're going to fail them. That's where the new test sets a bad precedent, because then you've got an aspect that's been introduced, which is annual testing of existing directors. So where would then that leave the Newcastle takeover? Where would that leave the Manchester City takeover? Where would potentially that leave others as well? So I think that it's going to be an extremely high bar for connecting individuals that are not directly put forwards when we're talking about human rights abuses and so on, which is why Amnesty have come out and said, listen, it's a step in the right direction, but it means nothing unless it's implemented practically and transparently and aggressively. So the words don't mean much change. It's how they're applied. And as I said before, whether Newcastle put themselves forwards for this new test or the old test, it's exactly the same thing. Before you can start implementing words like human rights abuses based on the global human rights sanctions regulations of 2020, you have to prove the connection. So step one is always, we've put forwards the following people, test them. Step two is there anybody else that is not listed that could control the club? And could they exert shadow influence? And then they have to be tested. So you would still have to go from PIF and Yasser Al-Rumayyan and so on to, we think they are influenced by X. Then if there is agreement that that wider either group or individual is tested, that's when you could have a problem for human rights abuses. But whether it says human rights abuses or not in the text, if you cannot make the connection to begin with because of these so-called legally binding assurances, then you still can't be testing the Saudi Arabian government, and you still can't be testing individuals like Mohammed bin Salman, which means that if Yasser Al-Rumayyan turned up today and was culpable for testing under these new criteria, and he will be because there is an annual revisiting of every individual, then is he going to be in breach of human rights abuses directly? And the answer to that question is no. Even again, if people say, but he was well in with Mohammed bin Salman, or he's part of government decision-making, or he's a sitting minister. These are the things where there's too many degrees of separation. And I stress once again, rightly or wrongly, because we all know that it's a grey area. We all know in reality that there is a debate to be had here. But this is about whether or not legally you can prove it. And I think it's very difficult under both tests regarding both Manchester United and also Newcastle United, which is why, as I said before, Amnesty are more of the belief that this is a step in the right direction, but it might not be as dramatic as the wording makes it appear. And then just to give you a 30-second overview, it's not just about human rights being inserted. The clubs have agreed that decisions will be subject to a new independent oversight panel. So that's quite significant, because it means that instead of going straight to arbitration or dispute, there's a way of verifying or referring information to an oversight panel, which adds an element of transparency. So that's good. And then there is this threshold of control, which is the key word in all of this, which has been lowered slightly. I don't think that that will make a great deal of difference. CEOs will be under consideration as well, which is quite interesting. And then there's a whole range of disqualification criteria, which, as I say, doesn't just include the human rights abuses aspect. It's also down to things like government sanctions, and also if you have been suspended or disqualified by various other regulatory authorities, such as the HMRC or the Gambling Commission. And then there's a broadening of the scope of the insolvency provision as well, which means that the Premier League can take action against individuals who are involved in previous insolvencies. And that means that they're effectively protecting the financial side of things. So owners are fiscally responsible and don't have a history of bad business management. So look, there's a lot to like in there, and there's a lot to challenge in there. And once again, there's a lot to see how it's applied practically, because the words alone mean nothing if there's these legal loopholes, if there's these grey areas. So I don't think that Newcastle have got a lot to worry about. And I think the underlying point in all of this is the clubs unanimously approved it. So if Newcastle thought tomorrow that the change to the test meant, yikes, we're going to be disqualified, why would they have voted for it?
I've got to ask you a question about other clubs' situations at the moment. It's questions we often get asked in the chat on NUFC Matters. Everton and their financial fair play issues, Manchester City, and you know the big news that broke a couple of months ago about them being under investigation. What's happening, Ben, on Everton and Manchester City's radars at the moment?
Well, once the Premier League start these investigations, they can't give an ongoing blow by blow. So with Manchester City, what's interesting is that it will be heard by an independent panel, and it could take, I would have thought, upwards of 3 or 4 years. But certainly we are unlikely to hear too much more on it in terms of a resolution or progress within the next couple of seasons. So this is a long-term process with no doubt a lot of lawyers delaying and debating. There's 100+ charges. And obviously Manchester City argue that they're innocent and that they've already been through this process, and having lost a ruling at UEFA, overturned it in the Court of Arbitration for Sport. And the key difference with Manchester City here is that some of the allegations of financial breaches from the Premier League were not heard by UEFA. And even if only a third of them are proved, the Premier League can immediately act and punish, and Manchester City do not have a recourse to go to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. So things are a little bit different to the previous case that Manchester City ended up winning on appeal. And we will see the Premier League be quite bullish in, I think, trying to not necessarily make a statement against Manchester City, but make a statement to all clubs that if there are breaches, they will be tried and investigated. But the key thing is, how will they be punished? And the punishment can range from losing and therefore the club being innocent to a fine, all the way down to disqualification and points deductions. And we'll have to wait and see how it transpires. And the crux of the allegations is around financial inflation, whereby Manchester City effectively are balancing their books by moving money around in ways that are not legal. And in particular, when Roberto Mancini was manager, there was an allegation that suggests he was paid 2 payments, not 1. And the secondary payment came from a third-party company to be off the books and not directly declarable via Manchester City. And these kind of things help with financial fair play as well. So how the case is handled is going to be very important. Manchester City have already lawyered up, and a very good lawyer as well, with Lord Panic. But they're saying there's no need for panic, and that they believe that they will be innocent. But it could take 3, 4, 5 years for us to get any further answers on this one. So we're going to have to wait and see on that one. I think with Everton, it's a little bit different because the charges are all a bit fresher, and quite clearly the Premier League are on this mission, whether the club is big or small, whether it's pandemic related, whether it's stadium planning related, or whether it's historical breaches. They absolutely want to ensure that they're on this investigation trail. So we now have to wait and see with Everton exactly how the charges against them manifest. And for those that are unaware, the Premier League have done a very similar thing to as with Manchester City, and they've referred Everton to an independent commission. The breaches are specifically about financial fair play last season. Everton say they're disappointed with the decision and that they strongly contest these allegations of non-compliance. And this is one of the issues, really, until we get an independent regulator, until we get more transparency. Once the Premier League release something, they're not obligated to go into any more detail until the investigation is complete and or a punishment is issued. So everybody is going to be a little bit in the dark. But what we do know is that Everton, under Premier League rules, could only make a maximum loss of 105 million over a 3-year cycle, but there were these special allowances for the COVID pandemic. And during the COVID pandemic, everybody declared a bit more favorably on the books, and you can also take advantage of that leeway. But Everton seemingly had a lot more COVID-related costs than other clubs, which I think set off a few alarm bells. And eventually the total loss recorded by Everton was something in the region of £370 million over 3 years. And again, to reiterate, you're only usually allowed 105 million, but there is a little bit of leeway due to the fact that there's the pandemic. So effectively what Everton are saying is that about 170 million of their losses within that 372, they claim, is down to the pandemic specifically, which is a huge amount. And even if you wipe off 170 million from 370 million, then you're still at 200 million and you're only allowed to lose 105 million. So whichever way you look at it, they're over the threshold. So it's up to the Premier League to determine two things. One, whether they're going to just punish them for being over the threshold. And that can entail points deductions, fines, or reprimands. And then two is, have they misled the Premier League, which is the separate thing? In other words, if you've exceeded the financial fair play, but you've been open and honest about it, you'll be investigated for rule breaches, and all those punishments I've outlined apply. But if you've actually manufactured a inflated COVID loss in a fraudulent way, that would obviously be a different thing and can also come with punishments such as points deductions and fines and reprimands as well. So the Premier League are going to have to work out, one, why Everton's losses are so high, and two, whether their losses, and particularly that pandemic estimation, because it's not in keeping with any other club, is genuine. And from there, they'll make their ruling. And I'd expect this one to conclude a little bit quicker than the Manchester City case. But there will be appeals, there will be legal delays, no doubt. So we have to wait and see what the timescale is, because once again, the Premier League are not being transparent about this. And until they put these type of things out in the open, until they show their process and allow people to understand what they're doing, how quickly they're doing it, who's taking the decisions, we're always going to be questioning what exactly is going on, much like we did with the Newcastle United takeover. So for me, it comes back to the T word again, transparency. And hopefully, even if it's in retrospect, once both these cases are resolved, a full account of them will be published and put out there so people can better understand the protocol that's currently taking place.
Halfway through the show, time for the ads. Big thanks to all our sponsors. Thanks to Skips and Bins. Telephone 0800 25 45 25 3. Email inquiries at skipsandbins.com. Website skipsandbins.com. Easy contract free and pay as you go waste collection. Thanks to Mr. Vicky's Sauces, handmade in Cumbria. And you can find them at mrvickies.co.uk. Email info@mrvickies.co.uk and place an order by phoning 01768 210 102. Thanks to Frui Vita Getaways. Book your holidays or short breaks in the UK or around the world with them. Let them find your happy place. ABTA and ATOL registered. You can contact them by emailing fruivitagetaways@gmail.com. Call or text 0792 842 7895. and join their Facebook group at Free Vita Getaways. Thanks to Media Arts for all the technical help and videos that they do. And thanks to qtechshop.co.uk, the makers of pool tables and snooker tables in Wallsend, Newcastle. If you want to join the channel, click join, and you can see the various rates that you can pay to help support us. If you want to join by subscribing, hit the subscribe button. That is free. Hit the thumb up under the video to help the algorithm, and click share to other social media platforms. If you do subscribe, we do give you a free car sticker. Just email John at nufcmatters.com and he will post you one out. If you want to join the cult, which is a one-off payment of £25, where you get a scarf, a pen, a cup, and entry into the monthly draw, then go to nufcmatters.com and look for the cult membership, or put your phone over this smart code and it will take you straight there. We are available as well as a podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, and the rest. And we do support the food bank on this channel. So if you want to make a virtual donation from anywhere in the world, go to nufcfansfoodbank.co.uk and put your money into the match day bucket. We've got some events coming up. First off in April, April the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th and 11th. Peter Beardsley Soccer School is back for ages 6 to 16 years. Go to peterbeardsleysoccerschool.com for more information. An evening with John Anderson at the Time House Surf Cafe, Tuesday the 18th of April. Book your tickets direct from the venue. An evening with Frank Clark and John Gibson 2 nights later, Thursday the 20th of April at the Irish Centre. Tickets from nufcmatters.com. An evening with Nobby Solano at Laurel's in Whitley Bay is May the 11th. So contact the venue direct if you want to go to that event. And we've got our NUFC Matters end of season party, which is the 27th of May at 7 o'clock. Tickets are a tenner from nufcmatters.com. An evening with Rob Lee at Louis Liquor Store, 1st of June, and tickets direct from the venue. And an evening with Rob Lee, Lee Clark and John Beresford, Friday the 2nd of June at the Grand Hotel Gosforth, which is in aid of the Healing Tour charity. And you can get your tickets direct from them at the healingtour.org.uk website. Just click events. A little bit later in the year, an evening with Gavin Peacock, July the 10th. Tickets from nufcmatters.com for that one. And if you like your boxing, a night of champions featuring Frank Bruno, Ricky Hatton, Nigel Benn and Joe Calzaghe. Tickets for that one from goldstarpromotions.com. Okay, Ben, we're often getting linked with players, even when the transfer window is a million weeks away. We shouldn't even be looking at it, but we're constantly getting linked with Scott McTominay, and he's been in the papers this week, and he's been in the headlines this week for going on a bit of a goal scoring spree. We're told he's a holding midfield player. He got forward not once, not twice, but 4 times for Scotland, and certainly did our ex coaches the world of good, John Carver and Steve Clark for Scotland. Stu Penman's been going on about it on the shows this week because he's Scottish through and through. What's your take on McTominay? Is that a viable move? And is it an improvement for Newcastle if they bring McTominay in?
Yeah, I think it is. And we know it's an area where Eddie Howe wants to strengthen. As you say, he's not really known as a goal scorer, but he's had a fantastic week. And Scott McTominay was a big part in particular of that phenomenal Scotland win over Spain by 2-0, in which he scored both of those goals, which is funny because that's 2 for Scotland in that game. And I think it's 2 all season and none in the Premier League for Manchester United, and only 1 in the Premier League last season for Manchester United. So maybe that's a hint with a little bit more freedom that he can be a goal scorer. But I think that Eddie Howe would be signing McTominay out of a desire really to get a little bit more discipline and depth in the central or defensive part of his midfield. And I think that what McTominay brings as well is a fair amount of leadership and composure on the ball. And this is not a new link. I think that it's blown up again in the media. But if you go back to the last transfer window and even into November, December, when I was on these shows, I was telling you that Newcastle's interest in Scott McTominay was very genuine at that point. The only difference is we're heading towards the end of the season now, where McTominay might be able to push a little bit more, because Erik ten Hag very much wanted to keep him at the football club until the end of this season. So there's sort of a balance in many ways between what Ten Hag and Manchester United want versus what McTominay is likely to want at the end of the season, because with Casemiro coming in, his game time has been limited. And I think he sees himself as a player that ultimately is starting week in, week out. So if he thinks he can get that at Newcastle United, there'll be a very realistic possibility that Manchester United, to an extent, begrudgingly let him go. And I think it will be begrudgingly, because Erik ten Hag would love the option of Scott McTominay. It's just a case of the fact that he's not necessarily been able to start as many times. It's 18 Premier League matches this season, and naturally the game time has gone down comparative to last season. So then people will obviously say, well, where would he fit in within Newcastle? And is he a depth player or is he a starting player? And I think that from Eddie Howe's perspective, he is somebody that can compete for a place in the starting 11 for sure. And it's a little bit different in some ways because Manchester United play a 4-2-3-1. So within that 4-2-3-1, you have two holding midfielders, which are effectively pushing McTominay out of the picture. And you can look at those two holding midfielders, depending on how Ten Hag chooses to line players up, as Casemiro plus Fred, Casemiro plus Bruno Fernandes, even if he's the one playing in a slightly deeper position. But either way, McTominay would slot into that too. And sometimes, of course, Erik ten Hag plays a 4-1-4-1 as well. So again, if Casemiro is the one, then there's no real room for McTominay because you're going to have Bruno Fernandes and somebody maybe like Sancho ahead. And then in that type of formation, even Fred is out the team as well. So this is where McTominay will be looking at that formation and working out where he could play. At Newcastle, I think what's very interesting is that if you look at Bruno in the centre of midfield, if you look at Joe Linton, who's played in a variety of positions, of course, he can play in the midfield or in the front three as well. They're all quite versatile, which means that even if Scott McTominay came in, it might give Bruno a bit more freedom, or it might allow Eddie Howe to change the formation, or maybe he sees McTominay as that kind of John Joe Shelvey type player. Now he's gone off to Forest, and it might be a Longstaff or a Willock or somebody that ends up going out of the side. But I think either way, because it's a three in midfield, McTominay will have a lot of value because they're three playing in a line, not a two. And of course, you're invited within that three to have one that's more advanced or two that get a bit wider. But on paper, when you're on the ball, it's a three. And McTominay has that versatility in a central area to offer Eddie Howe different formations or play within that three. And if he plays within that three, he's either going to be able to be a bit more advanced at Newcastle, which is where the goal scoring might come in, as per Scotland, or he might be that disciplined holding one and it might bring the best out of Bruno. So there's a lot to like, I think, about the fit of McTominay, both within the current system, 4-3-3, and any tweaks that Eddie Howe chooses to make. And if this happens, it won't be because there's suddenly an opportunity. McTominay is a player that Newcastle have been looking at now for the best part of 6 months very seriously. So it wouldn't remotely surprise me if they try and get this one done and as early as they can come the summer.
Interesting one. We'll wait and see. Take the pressure off us trying to sign Leicester's players as well, Ben, I think. Yeah, I mean, because those stories will never go away as well. I mean, Ward-Prowse seems to be featuring quite heavily as well with Newcastle. I guess as well, a lot depends on who stays up and who goes down, Ben, when it comes to the transfer merry-go-round.
That's it. I mean, you're looking at a target and you know that some players may not be available in the market if that team stays up. James Ward-Prowse could be an example of that. Also depends on the player's ambition. Of course, if Newcastle make Champions League football and go for James Ward-Prowse, you would have thought that he's got the ambition to join. But if Newcastle finish in 6th place and Southampton stay up, then who knows? He might like living on the South Coast, having full control of set pieces and, you know, ultimately the consistency of his current job on his current wage. So there's a lot of ifs and buts. It's the same with Lavia as well at Southampton. If they go down, he'll almost certainly go. If they stay up, he could potentially stay for another season. And even though I don't think Newcastle are going to be seriously in the race for him, they clearly admire Declan Rice. And if they get Champions League football, you never know. But whether or not they are prepared to break that wage structure and pay, in all likelihood, 75 million plus, we'll have to wait and see. But again, if West Ham go down, every suitor's in a stronger position. If West Ham stay up, then they'll still lose Declan Rice in all likelihood, but you might have to pay even higher. And once again, that might push Newcastle out of the race. With James Maddison, similar kind of thing, but I think that he'll leave regardless of whether Leicester stay up or go down. So there's an opportunity there. But it's so difficult at this stage to do anything other than scout players and approach on the player side. Because if you want to start a conversation with Leicester today, they're going to say, speak to us at the end of the season, because they want Maddison to focus on keeping them up. And the last thing they want to do is pre-agree anything now, because times are uncertain. And the selling club, if in this extreme example and rare example, if they have assets that they know they're going to lose if they go down, they don't yet know what the budgets are, because there's a big difference, especially in this league, which is so tight. There's a big difference between staying up by 3 points, which might mean you're 12th, by the way, in the table. So think of the difference in prize money between going down versus finishing 12th. And there might only be 3 to 5 points between that kind of gulf. And then if you go down, there's different budgets. You have to look at your wages. You have to look at who else might leave. You have to look at how you can ultimately stay afloat. So negotiating now isn't helpful, because as long as there's uncertainty, suitors will play off that. So a lot of clubs would prefer to either go down and then deal with it, or stay up and then be in a stronger negotiating position, because financially they're on a healthier footing. And that's why it's almost impossible at this stage to get anything pre-agreed with a club that's fighting relegation. They're solely focused on the football side, and they want their players to be as well. Because even if Leicester lost James Maddison to Newcastle, the last thing they want to do is have Maddison know he's out the door now to any club, because if they do that, then he's not focused. So instead, they're going to make absolutely sure that they shield the player from any transfer speculation and make it clear that if he keeps them up, all options are on the table. And I'm sure West Ham are saying that to Rice. Like, sources have always said they're resigned to losing him. But when David Moyes talks to Declan Rice, it's much more about lead us out of trouble, and then we'll be in a position to work with you, to seek your opinion on other signings, to give you a bump in wage. And none of that matters, because Rice is going to say, I want to leave anyway. And West Ham know that. But that's still the approach you take as a manager, because otherwise what you're doing is you're further unsettling your side. And in the same way that Antonio Conte was always outgoing at Spurs, and look at the impact it's had on the football team, particularly since the World Cup. If players are like that, it's even worse, because how invested are they? How much do they really care? And to stay up, you need everybody to care and be focused and on the same page. So your Maddisons, your Ward-Prowses, very difficult to make any progress with until either sides get safe or we get right towards the end of the season. But I think that McTominay's different because, as I said before, he's not starting games for Manchester United with any kind of regularity. And it's been clear since January that he's looking for other options, not because he doesn't love Ten Hag or Manchester United, but just because he sees himself as a starter. And if Newcastle can offer that to him, then there really is a very real possibility that that transfer will happen.
£200,000 a week wages, paper talk or a reality for Maddison?
Well, Newcastle will have to break their wage structure to an extent for these type of players. And I do think that Maddison will command 150 to 200,000. It all depends as well whether it's a base wage or bonuses. I'd be surprised if it's that much plus bonuses. And sometimes the papers quote an all-in-one figure, like Bukayo Saka's contract might hit 15 million, but it's actually only about 9 or 10 million plus an extra 4 or 5 million in bonuses. So James Maddison, England international, right age, right profile, exceptional for Leicester, particularly in the first half of the season, even though there's been adversity, absolutely worth 120 to 140,000 in my opinion in wages. 200,000 seems a bit excessive, because once you give that to Maddison, there's a lot of other players at Newcastle United that will be asking for similar or better. And it's fine if Newcastle want their wages to be 150 to 250 over time. But what they've done very well, and it's one of the few things really, like him or loathe him, and everyone listening will loathe him, I'm sure, but with Mike Ashley, he kept the wage bill consistent. And not everyone loved how stringent he was, but consistency is underrated with wage bills, because the last thing that players want to feel like is they've done all the hard work of qualifying for Champions League, let's say, and then in comes 3 new players and they're all on 200 to 250,000, which is a Champions League wage for an elite level player. And then you're, let's just say, somebody like Dan Burn or even Sven Botman, and you're thinking, yikes. And if you're Botman, you've only just joined and you're not going to get a renewal, I don't think, at the beginning of next season. And if there's a massive gulf and you're the one that is getting all the plaudits, and it could be the same for a Nick Pope. Obviously, Bruno will have the ability to renegotiate a contract, and I think that will get signed on a very high number as well. But then what about Callum Wilson? What about Joe Willock, etc.? So Newcastle have done very well to keep their wage bill, for both sustainability reasons and unity and morale, pretty consistent and low comparative, as you would expect, to these clubs that are in Europe or in the Champions League season on season. So I think that 200k is a nice rounded, big, sensational number, maybe with bonuses, but we have to wait and see. But what I would say is that if Newcastle don't qualify for Champions League football, I don't foresee a scenario where they're bringing in players with that kind of base wage, not only because it's a bit reckless financially before you've got that regularity of Champions League football, but also there's a real danger you unsettle the squad with a bunch of new people that haven't achieved anything yet at the club, regardless of if they're liked, like Maddison, regardless of their reputation. If they're suddenly one of or the highest earners at the club, that can be very unsettling in a dressing room. So I think Newcastle will be quite smart about it. And I think if they miss out on a target because the wage demands are too high, then in the long term, that will actually benefit them, because they just don't want to get into that forced scenario like Leicester. I've probably explained this before, where success comes too quick. So you have to pay top dollar because you've got Europe, and you have to pay bonuses, and then you bring in all these exciting new players. And then what happens the season afterwards? What if Newcastle finish 10th and then don't make Champions League for 2-3 years? You've suddenly got these divisions where more loyal players that then are at points of renewal are never going to get that Champions League wage. And you've maybe got a few players on your books, whether they're working out or not, that are just significantly higher earners. And I think that can create problems for you in that dressing room and under financial fair play. And Leicester had that. They won the Premier League. Everyone got a raise or a new contract. They brought in a load of new players, all on higher wages. They did well in the Champions League. Everyone got a bonus. They were in the mix for Champions League football for 2 back-to-back seasons, but they missed out on the final day. Everyone got a bonus because you're Leicester. And I think Newcastle will be the same, that they're going to get bonuses for Europa League football, even if they collapse and don't get anywhere near Champions League football in the end. It won't be a disaster season. They're all going to get bonuses. So this is the challenge, that if you're not an elite club that's had a decade in Europe, you are climbing. And if you climb too fast, then how can you not reward the players for finishing in the top half, or finishing in the Europa Conference League, or finishing in the Europa League? Just because they've been in and around the top 4, it doesn't mean that that's the only bar of success. They absolutely will make more money whatever happens this season, because last season they were fighting relegation. So they've improved. They're going to finish in the top half. If they qualify for any European football, it will be bonuses all round. You just got to be careful that everything doesn't go up too quickly to the point where you actually are uncomfortable financially speaking with the size of your wage bill before the success has become consistent and reliable to offset that with the money that you make through that success.
I mean, you know, a couple of weeks since we've had you on, but I think most people who follow NUFC Matters, we've come to the conclusion that Champions League will be great. Look, it'll be a journey. It could help us attract more players. Financially, it's more rewarding, especially if you can get past that initial group stage. You have to have a bit of luck with the draw, of course. But Newcastle United have got a great opportunity this season, really, to qualify for Europe. So why not go for the biggest and best tournament in the world and hopefully with that manage to attract better players, Ben?
Yeah, and I think that coming back to Champions League, it's an exceptional chance because Tottenham are in such a state of drama and crisis at the moment, and there's only that 2-point gap. So Newcastle have got 2 games in hand to effectively get 2 points, and then if they did that, and 2 points would be deemed a bad return, 2 draws from the games in hand, but if they did that, they're above Tottenham on goal difference. So I look at Newcastle's run-in, and I think that one of the key things in all of this is that 3 of the really big, difficult games are all at St James's Park. Home to Manchester United, home to Spurs, which is obviously the massive one, and home to Arsenal. And even though those are challenging, as is away at Chelsea on the final game, Newcastle will have wanted to qualify by then to avoid any sweating about going to Stamford Bridge, even though Chelsea's form is not great. Chelsea may have nothing to play for on that final game of the season, and we know that that's always a risky type of fixture. So obviously home to Manchester United on Sunday, massive. Because if you win that, everyone calms down a bit. Some extent, you revenge the League Cup final, and then you say, okay, we fancy ourselves to win at West Ham, away at Brentford, and away at Villa. But if you lose to Manchester United, suddenly those 3 games on the road become 3 tricky away trips. And then there's pressure building up to home to Spurs. And I've said this many times that usually we consider the race for Champions League football down the stretch, in which case, from Newcastle's perspective, you'd be looking at home to Southampton, home to Arsenal, away at Leeds, home to Leicester, which is obviously one that they're going to lose 5-0, and then away to Chelsea on the final game of the season. But I feel like it's not about that run-in. It's really about Manchester United get a statement win off the back of the international break, calm everybody down while Spurs are in crisis. Then 3 away games, and then it's going to be a cup final at home to Tottenham. And if they get anything from that Tottenham game, they're either going to protect their position or they're going to be creating breathing space from Spurs. And this is exactly what Newcastle want. So I think that it's in their hands. Everyone's talking about Liverpool because they, of course, have also got 2 games in hand over Tottenham. But there's still that 5-point gap between Newcastle and Liverpool, which again is what makes Manchester United so important. Because one, if Newcastle beat Manchester United, and I think this is the thing that people always forget, they go ahead of Manchester United because they've got a better goal difference. So then it's not only about Spurs, Newcastle, or Liverpool from behind. You're putting another variable in, which is, well, we could also finish above Manchester United. So it's not only then about what Spurs do or what Liverpool do. It's Newcastle getting a big win and closing the gap. If they lose to Manchester United, you start to think maybe we won't finish above Manchester United. Then you start thinking, well, what have Spurs and Liverpool done if we lose to Manchester United? And that's the point where maybe panic starts to set in. And the thing about the run-in away from Newcastle's fixtures is that I think Spurs have got a number of winnable games over the course of the next few weeks, which means that if they can make Newcastle feel nervous, they may have the ability to extend their lead. Because Tottenham away at Everton, winnable game. Home to Brighton, winnable game. Home to Bournemouth, winnable game. But if Newcastle can just steady the ship a little bit and get a big win in that period, from there, Tottenham have got to go away at Newcastle. They've got to go, I think, home to Manchester United. They've got to go away at Liverpool. And then on the last game of the season, they've got to go away at Leeds, which is not going to be an easy game, especially if Leeds are fighting for their lives. So this, again, is why Newcastle need to make sure that they don't have a wobble now. And then from Liverpool's perspective, it's really quite difficult because I think they come out of the international break and they've got to go away at Manchester City and then, I believe, away at Chelsea and then home to Arsenal. So if you're Newcastle and you're looking at the Man U game and then those 3 away fixtures, you're saying to yourself, if we get anything from Manchester United, we're going to get more points than Liverpool in the early part of April, and we're going to put pressure on Tottenham, and we've already got our fate in our own hands because we've got 2 games in hand over Tottenham. So every which way I look at it, whether it's from the perspective of Newcastle's fixtures or other clubs' fixtures, my conclusion is the same, that it's not about how Newcastle finished the season with those games against Southampton, Arsenal, Leeds, Leicester, Chelsea. It's really about this first 2 weeks in April. Manchester United, West Ham, Brentford, Aston Villa. Take at least 7 points from those games and they set themselves up very, very nicely to qualify for the top 4. But lose to Manchester United and suddenly those away games become nervy. And then don't get anything at West Ham, who are scrapping for their life. And then away at Brentford suddenly isn't easy. And then Aston Villa, even though they've been a bit inconsistent of late, you start to worry. And then it's sort of doom and gloom about, well, are we going to blow it at Spurs? And then if we don't beat Spurs at home, how does that affect the dressing room? How does that affect the table? So for me, it is April the 2nd to April the 23rd, which ends with home to Spurs, that's going to define whether Newcastle do or don't make the top 4.
Quick one on the Hall of Fame shortlist of nominees for the Premier League. Tony Adams, Sol Campbell, Michael Carrick, Petr Cech, Andrew Cole from Newcastle, of course, and Manchester United, Ashley Cole, Jermaine Defoe, Les Ferdinand, another Newcastle United player, Rio Ferdinand, Robbie Fowler, Gary Neville, Michael Owen, lesser known for his time at Newcastle, of course, but still played in the black and white stripes, John Terry, Yaya Toure, and, of course, Nemanja Vidic. Who do you think is going to make it past the shortlist?
Yeah, the first is that I was getting a lot of messages and a lot of debate, and some people don't really realise that this is not a new thing. So there's 16 players already acknowledged, and therefore when people saw the list, they were messaging me and saying, where's Shearer? Well, he's already in it. Where's Lampard? He's already in it. Where's Beckham? He's already in it. Where's Aguero? He's already in it. Where's Drogba? He's already in it. So there's a illustrious list that's already there. And then what we're left with is actually 1 or 2 players that perhaps people were putting forwards in previous shortlists that were not included. And it's very difficult to, I think, pick between them. There's a few names that leap out. One is Les Ferdinand, a fantastic Premier League servant for Tottenham and for Newcastle United. The other's Robbie Fowler. I know that a lot of energy and probably votes will go towards Michael Owen, but let's not forget that Michael Owen had his fair share of injuries as well, and his numbers are good, but Fowler was a born finisher. Fowler set the Premier League alight, and not as many people may remember Fowler, but go back and watch those highlights, and every single time Robbie Fowler was in a lethal position, he would finish. And it reminds me of Vardy at his peak as well. So I'd love to see Fowler in there. I think that you can make an argument for sure for Terry and for Toure. And then there's a range of top defenders in there as well, particularly, I suppose, to older generations, Tony Adams, but what a player Vidic was as well. So you can see how it's going to be difficult to pick any one individual. And we haven't even spoken about Petr Cech, one of the greatest goalkeepers within the Premier League. If I had to pick, let's say 3, then I would be drawn towards Yaya Toure, Robbie Fowler, and then one other. And that's where I'm sort of torn, because you've got John Terry, like him or loathe him, iconic defender. You got Michael Owen, who a lot of people think is the one that will make it. And you got Les Ferdinand. And for me, Because I'm on a Newcastle podcast, I'm going to say Les Ferdinand.
Very good, Ben. Very good. I didn't expect anything else, to be honest. Newcastle play Manchester United this weekend. This program, of course, going out Saturday. We play them Sunday 4:30 live on Sky Sports. Revenge mission for Newcastle after the cup final defeat.
Yeah, revenge mission and learning mission are the two ways that I'd put it. And the reason why I say both is because it's 2 games now against Manchester United, and ultimately in both, I thought Newcastle were at times a little bit passive. So in the League Cup final, Manchester United just kind of had that game management. I thought Newcastle could have actually won the game at Old Trafford in the 0-0 draw in October, but nonetheless, they still had less than 40% of the ball. They still only, I think, had 2 shots on target in the game, and they allowed Manchester United to dictate the tone. And for whatever reason, that 4-3-3 isn't or hasn't been against Manchester United particularly effective or conducive against a 4-2-3-1. And Manchester United deserve some credit for that, because as we said when we spoke about the League Cup final, some of it is down to just the experienced Manchester United players knowing exactly how to manage out the game. And of course, in the League Cup final, Newcastle were pretty good for the opening half an hour, but the problem was after Casemiro got the opener, Rashford was able to double the lead inside about 5 minutes, and from there it was game over. But the difference between the league game and the League Cup final is that Manchester United had 10 shots on target in the League Cup final, and Newcastle once again only had 2 shots on target. So this is a big opportunity, not at a neutral venue and not at Old Trafford, for Newcastle to be more aggressive, more dominant, more on the front foot, and show, presuming that Howe sticks with 4-3-3, that this is a team and a formation that can adapt and can break through that 2 that are in front of the back 4, and that can cause Varane and Martinez problems, and can play with width, and can get forwards directly and quickly on the counter-attack. Because everything I've seen so far from Newcastle against Manchester United, they've been stifled, and big players have not been able to perform on the big occasion as a result. And I don't want to sound overly critical, because I genuinely believe that some of that is down to the quality and game management of Manchester United. But this is Newcastle at home. This is Newcastle at St James's Park. This is Newcastle that have had an entire international break to prepare for the game. So there's kind of no excuses, and I expect to see a more dominant Newcastle, a more aggressive Newcastle, and for the first time this season to score against Manchester United. But it's not going to be easy. And, you know, the main thing in all of this for Newcastle is about refinding that fluidity and that rhythm and that goal-scoring touch, because away at Nottingham Forest, they won it, and it was a massive goal in injury time from the penalty spot from Isak. But still, it was quite a laboured performance, and they didn't look, Newcastle, in my opinion, clinical. They had many, many chances to try and score and get ahead in that game earlier. But in the end, it was a bit of a struggle. And then against Wolves, it needed a relatively late Almiron winner. And in both those games, they also didn't keep clean sheets, which was the hallmark of the opening part of the season. And then, of course, if we go back a little bit further than that, we have that run of games where they didn't score and they lost to Man City. They didn't score and they lost to Manchester United in the Cup. They didn't score and they lost to Liverpool, albeit with that freak and early sending off of Nick Pope. They laboured to a 1-1 draw against Bournemouth. They had a disappointing 1-1 draw against West Ham, who were excellent, by the way, in that game. And then they obviously got through against Southampton over 2 legs. But let's not forget, before that, there was a relatively frustrating 0-0 draw against Crystal Palace. So if you sort of go back to January, we're seeing Newcastle either not win games very narrowly, and not keep as many clean sheets as they were doing before the World Cup break, or even in the early part of January. And that's the thing I think that will frustrate Eddie Howe, that after thrashing Leicester with a clean sheet before the New Year came in, and after the World Cup, and having entered into the World Cup break with that 1-0 win over Chelsea, it looked like it was business as usual. And then even though they didn't beat Leeds, that was another clean sheet. Away at Arsenal was excellent. That was another clean sheet. But for whatever reason, we've kind of got into the mid-January period and beyond. And then suddenly Newcastle have kind of stopped scoring and stopped keeping clean sheets. And that's really the worry in all of this. They have to find a way to shut out teams, and they have to find a way to enter into that pre-World Cup period where they were just much more effective and dynamic at dispatching sides and killing them off. And, you know, without bringing back nightmares, you think back to Boxing Day and how quickly and easily and decisively they ran riot in about half an hour in the first half against Leicester. That's the Newcastle we need to see. But if they don't have that in their locker at the moment, then if they're keeping a clean sheet, they'll only need one goal. But as long as they're not keeping clean sheets and not scoring, that's the recipe for disaster. And they've been a bit lucky in many ways because, as I said to you before, they beat Forest, but only just in injury time. They beat Wolves, but it was laboured. But then all the games before that were losses without scoring and against big teams. So now they've got an opportunity to come back against a big team, and a big team they've not scored against, and a big team that they've been dominated by, and show what they've learned and get something from the game. And I think if they walk away with a point, it will be a very good result. And if they win the game, I think it will set them up for the run-in and give them the momentum they need to qualify for the Champions League.
Last question then, your prediction for the game this weekend?
Well, I think unfortunately, despite saying Newcastle need a clean sheet, I don't think they'll keep one. And therefore, they're going to have to score, which I think they'll do. So I'm going to go for 1-1, a low-scoring draw. And I believe that will be a good result for Newcastle because Manchester United are in good form. They've got momentum. And the other thing I want to look out for, like I said before, is what Eddie Howe does with the formation, because I don't think that 4-3-3 has worked against Manchester United in the 2 games that I've seen. So does that mean you've got to change the personnel or the approach? Or is it just by being at home, Newcastle will be able to be on the front foot? But they need to start the game well because, as the League Cup final showed, if they do fall behind, Manchester United are very, very good on the game management side. So I don't think, unfortunately, Newcastle will win the game, but at home, I don't think they'll lose it either. So 1-1 is my prediction.
1-1. I'm going 2-1. As always, Ben, a mammoth show from you. Some great 2-1 to Newcastle. Great answers from you, as always. I'm sure you've cleared up a few questions for our NUFC Matters family. Look forward to having you on again soon, Ben. Take care, mate.
All the best. Have a good week, everyone.